Starfield, one of the most talked about and debated games, seems to be headed to having a 1.0 moment. And yes, I am saying 1.0 moment because much of this year was spent adding quality of life fixes, patches, and removing bugs. And they even added a performance mode to consoles, and I believe that finally brought the game to a status of feature complete. And the DLC, Shattered Space, will act as sort of a capstone to that, bringing the game to what I feel is a 1.0 foundational status so that they can actually focus on having that turnaround moment in the future. And the latest Starfield Shattered Space deep dive looks like Bethesda is getting back to their roots. Since the launch of Starfield, I have always thought that the game could take the cyberpunk route and really craft their own 2.0 moment. Now, sometimes I refer to this as a No Man's Sky moment, but I really think cyberpunk is the better comparison due to all the bug fixes and patches that they had to do throughout its life. I really think Bethesda is committed to doing that for Starfield, especially after watching the latest Starfield Shattered Space deep dive video. It seems to be taking direct aim at the core problems with the base game of Starfield, namely, too much reliance on procedurally generated content, not enough handcrafted areas, a lack of punch and fluidity in the combat, much of the weapon pool feeling like an extension of Fallout 4, and the overall tone of the game feeling somewhat bland and uninteresting. All those things look to be either directly improved or addressed in the latest gameplay footage, and I want to break it down. Now, every weekday here on Reforge Gaming, I tell you what I think about a gaming topic, and then we go to a live stream, and I want to hear what you think. So if you like this content, hit like and subscribe. One of the leading causes for complaint in Starfield from longtime Bethesda fans was the over-reliance on procedural generation. Going back into games like Skyrim or Fallout, you can still see the love and the care that was poured into the environmental storytelling. But more than that, it really helps set the tone of the game, which I'm going to talk about more later, but the latest trailer really makes it clear that Shattered Space will take place on one planet only. I think this will help immensely for a variety of reasons. First, they can leverage the environment to tell a whole new story. This is important for both returning players as well as those who really went the distance with Starfield. Both types of players get a lot of value from a completely new story, and one location will really help make Shattered Space stand apart. Secondly, it will help condense down what felt too spread out in Starfield. The initial response to the number of planets when they announced the game, it was really negative from both sides. Some felt that it wasn't enough planets because they were looking for a space exploration game, and I really felt there were a lot of unfair comparisons to No Man's Sky. Others felt it was too many planets and that a smaller number of handcrafted planets would have been better. Shattered Space being contained to one planet can help better cement the game's identity and make it clear they don't intend to overwhelm the player with a vast exploration experience, but be more of a mixture of exploration, adventure, and good storytelling. The third thing that I think one location really helps with is that it can set solid expectation for future DLCs. It's the perfect opportunity to create thematic planets that have their own enemies, their own stories, and more importantly, weapons and abilities. A really great way to expand a game like Starfield is to do it laterally, creating what I call contextual power. So you have a whole new planet, and it can have its own rules, its own weapon and damage types, and enemies with strengths and weaknesses tied to any of the new weapons or abilities that you might give the player. This doesn't completely unseat the base game or even a previous DLC, but it gives the devs a lot of room to experiment and innovate. A real common challenge, I think, for games when they add content is that it is either accused of being, well, it's just more of the same, or it changes too much. Using planets in Starfield to sort of encase the new content, I think it could be a really great recipe to make the game go long term, especially when you want to add new weapons and new abilities, because you can have somebody expanding their arsenal or expanding their power, but sort of self-containing that so you don't upset what they've worked on, but you also don't make it feel like they're constantly having to escalate or power creep or just run on this treadmill. Because listen, in the realm of weapons and ability, I notice a lot about the combat in the latest footage. In a world where first-person shooters are abundant, it can be difficult to stand out. But what shouldn't be difficult is making first-person shooter combat feel good. There are the obvious standouts in games like Destiny or Titanfall, and even Apex Legends and Call of Duty are considered very solid first-person shooter experiences. Heck, even Borderlands 3 was a huge improvement over the first two games. And Starfield was a game that largely only impressed with its combat if you just stuck to comparing it to past Bethesda games, which I think is fair on one hand, but on the other hand, it's not all that helpful. I mean, it's fair because you're tracking how the developer's been improving in their craft, and many of those who dove into Starfield were coming straight from other Bethesda titles. Maybe you were just playing through Fallout 4 or Fallout 76, and you would honestly say, wow, the gunplay does feel better in this game. But the reason it can be unhelpful is because there are so many stellar shooters out there. I don't really care if you manage to make your game feel better than a game that came out 8 or 9 years ago. But I will say, the latest footage of combat actually looks better in a variety of ways. First, the guns themselves. They look more futuristic and unique, which I think was a mark against the weapon pool in vanilla Starfield. Many of the weapons looked and even handled in a way that made me feel like I was just sort of playing Fallout 5 in space, which that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think it worked against Starfield having its own identity within the Bethesda catalog, and the latest guns seem to be leaning more into the sci-fi, futuristic, extraterrestrial territory. Now, the second thing that I think looks good about the combat is honestly how fast the enemies die. And yes, I know this can be tweaked in the settings, but I don't feel like doing the dev's job. Combat and time to kill should always be crafted in a way that feels rewarding and well-paced. If the meat and potatoes, sort of run-of-the-mill enemies feel like bullet sponges, it can work against combat flow, and subsequently really work against my enjoyment. I don't need every enemy to be a one-hit piece of tissue paper, but I also don't need them to be annoyingly tanky either. Now, the third thing that I think looks better about the combat is the new enemies. I'm fine with having human enemies, but my memory of the first 10 hours in Starfield was a lot of outposts, getting in gunfights with bandits that felt very similar to my time in Fallout 4. This is where limiting the DLC to one planet can really help as well. Creating species with new abilities or new movesets can really help the game feel fresh. And the more they move away from what feels similar to Fallout, and the more they move into the space and sort of the sci-fi genre, the better. I'm also really hoping that the performance mode on the Xbox Series X can make the combat feel more smooth and more fluid as well. It never really felt bad on PC, which is where I spent most of my time, but it never felt particularly great either. Any work in that department will be much appreciated, as I felt the gunplay in Cyberpunk vastly improved when I dove into Phantom Liberty, and it had a direct impact on my enjoyment of that DLC. Now, if you push back and you say, combat's always been great in Starfield, that's fine. You can have that opinion. Just remember, it's really hard to give credit to Bethesda for all their hard work and all the improvements if you keep claiming the game was always great and had no major issues. This is why honest and fair criticism is important. You set the game on a trajectory for improvement and even redemption, rather than just sort of hand-waving and claiming, well, the game's always been great, which leads me to one more thing that I really noticed about the Shattered Space deep dive. This might sound completely out of left field, or maybe you'll agree with me, but the latest Shattered Space video, it really reminded me of a DLC from another game the further and further I watched the deep dive. Roughly 1 year after releasing, Destiny 1 launched The Taken King, and it brought a whole new tone and vibe with it. A completely new location with dark and ominous feel. It was littered with dark enemies, and they would seemingly appear out of thin air. And to be clear, I'm not saying Shattered Space is going to be like The Taken King, but I can't help but see the similarities. And it honestly gives me a lot of hope for the content. For starters, because content like this feels like it's flowing out of passion and artistic vision, and not just trying to hit a product release date. It also is the type of content that can really turn the tide of public perception. The game's score right now on Steam is still incredibly poor, with an unimpressive 59% after 100,000 reviews. Even on its home turf, the Xbox console, the game has a 3.4 out of 5, which is a 68%. And a recent round of insiders and rumors are pointing to this game eventually landing on the PS5. Yes, you didn't think I'd make a video about Starfield and not mention that it's probably coming to PS5, but in all seriousness, I actually do believe the game is headed for PlayStation, and the quality of life updates, the performance modes, the Shattered Space DLC, that's a really great way to get this game ready to be very solid and feature complete as a redeemed game to sell to new customers, which is honestly what fans of Bethesda games and gaming in general should really be cheering for. I think games with the broadest foundation are the ones that run the risk of being the most incomplete at launch. The expression, a mile wide and an inch deep, really comes up in a lot of games, and it seems to always land on the games that have the most ambition and the biggest vision. But I also think that games with the broadest foundation are the ones most ripe for comeback moments. Some of the most memorable are Destiny 1, No Man's Sky, and Cyberpunk. All three very different games, but they all seem to suffer from similar foundational mistakes. Broad scope, really big ideas, and they almost fold backwards and drown the game in mediocrity. You just can't create that much depth when you're going that broad. But all three games found ways to reinvent themselves, to deliver new content, and to add substance. And obviously, opinions may vary on those three games, but I watched all of them pull this off over the years, and it really makes me want to see the exact same thing happen for Starfield. It's an undeniably very broad game, and it's hard to argue with the consumer response. It really did not win or wow the masses, and much of the systems and the gameplay felt very much locked in time, outdated, and lacking in innovation. Well, Shattered Space reminds me of all three of those games that I just mentioned, but in different ways. There's this moment where all of a sudden there's this glimmer in the game that can become a beacon. A new idea, a new space, a new piece of content. It elevates the game beyond its original form. For Cyberpunk, it was a long road of improvements and free content that allowed for Phantom Liberty to soar. For No Man's Sky, it's been a steady commitment to large-scale updates and new content loops. For Destiny, it was a DLC that centered around a new location with new weapons and enemies and a dark and more foreboding tone that added a level of seriousness to the game. Shattered Space can be that first step for Starfield, delivering what I've already called a 1.0 moment, which in my mind is the only way we get to a future 2.0 moment where the game truly turns a corner. But those are just my thoughts. And now it's time to hear your thoughts. And you can do that in a comment below or come to the live stream that follows this video. It'll hit a card right here. It'll also be in a pinned comment below. And if you like this content and you want more like it, please remember to like, share, and subscribe.